It was a chilly October evening in 1974 when two young trainee nurses, Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans, disappeared from the quiet town of Toowoomba, Queensland. What started as a routine day soon spiraled into one of Australia's most haunting unsolved cases, shrouded in silence, fear, and a community unwilling to confront the dark truth. Imagine for a moment two bright young women, full of hope and promise, vanishing without a trace, their screams echoing silently through the Australian ranges, cries ignored by neighbors, friends, and the very system meant to protect them. The story of Lorraine and Wendy is more than just a cold case. It is a chilling testament to the consequences of poor policing, the power of fear, and a society's failure to act when evil is in plain sight. In 2003, decades after that fateful day, author David Whitaker brought this tragedy back to public attention with his book, The Echo of Silent Screams. His words reignited the call for justice, pushing the Queensland Police Commissioner to reopen the investigation. The case was handed to Detective Inspector Kerry Johnson, a former member of the homicide squad renowned for his success in solving cold cases. For the first time, every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every long-forgotten detail was meticulously re-examined. What became glaringly apparent was the depth of failure. Years of poor policing, lack of resources, and conflicting testimonies had allowed the killers to walk free, their crimes buried beneath layers of silence and fear. Detective Johnson, driven by a sense of duty to bring closure to the Wilson and Evans families, vowed to leave no stone unturned. He re-interviewed key witnesses and persons of interest, piecing together fragmented memories and searching for gaps that could finally reveal the truth. It soon became clear that the horrifying events of that night were no secret. In Toowoomba, whispers and rumors about the gang of men involved had circulated for years. Yet time and again, fear and intimidation kept people from speaking out. The morning after the murders, a neighbor of Wayne Hilton, one of the suspected gang members, reported seeing him pulling the carpet out of a green Holden, a car linked to the suspects. When questioned, Hilton told her to mind her own business. Yet the neighbor noticed a large reddish-brown stain on the carpet, looking suspiciously like blood. Another associate, Desmond Hilton, recounted a chilling tale of men bragging about brutally beating two girls down the bottom of the range. Desmond had been offered beer in exchange for cleaning their car, which had blood smeared across the back seat as if someone injured had been dragged inside. Desmond said Hilton and others went back to check on the girls and returned with blood on their hands. It was only years later that he learned the full extent of the horror, that the girls they spoke about were Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans. Donald Laurie, another gang member, terrified and guilt-ridden, had confessed to a friend years later, "We killed the nurses. I was there." Despite this, the fear of retaliation kept him and others silent. Even bystanders who witnessed parts of the attack chose not to intervene. Neil and Jocelyn, a married couple driving down Toowoomba Range that Sunday, saw cars pulled over, clothing scattered on the roadside, and men forcing young women into vehicles, women screaming for help. Yet fear kept them driving on. Another couple, Vivian and Rose, witnessed a struggle between a man and a woman on the car bonnet. Rose later tried to report the incident to police but never heard back. Norma, a local resident, experienced a terrifying encounter when a frantic young woman sought refuge in her home, only to be dragged away moments later. Tara Mead's screams and struggles outside. The woman's desperate pleas and cries haunted Norma for years. Despite all these witnesses, official police follow-up was lackluster at best, and many reports were never properly investigated. The victim-blaming culture of the 1970s and fear of reprisal kept the community silent, allowing the perpetrators to escape justice. For nearly 40 years, Lorraine's family lived with the pain of losing their daughter and the agony of unanswered questions. Her brother Eric, desperate for closure, pushed for a renewed inquest to uncover the truth and hold the suspects accountable. In 2013, public pressure and new evidence finally forced authorities to reopen the case. The 7 primary suspects, members of the infamous Hilton and Laurie gang, were publicly named for the first time. The inquest uncovered stories of habitual sexual assault, violence, and intimidation that had terrorized the community for years. But despite the mounting evidence, the identity of the killers could not be fully confirmed, except for one man, Wayne "Boogie" Hilton, who had died years earlier in a car accident. The inquest closed with a bitter truth. Justice had been denied for Lorraine and Wendy. The other suspects had either died or could not be prosecuted due to lack of conclusive evidence. But the exposure of their crimes finally shattered the silence that had protected them for decades. Today, the legacy of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans serves as a grim reminder of the consequences when society turns a blind eye to evil. Their story is a call to remember and to act, so that silence no longer shields the guilty, and justice may one day prevail. Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans were both young women with bright futures ahead. Trainee nurses at St. George Hospital in Sydney, they shared a close friendship and a passion for helping others, especially in psychiatric nursing, a field Lorraine was deeply drawn to. In early October 1974, both Lorraine and Wendy head to Toowoomba, a quiet regional city nestled in Queensland's scenic ranges. Their visit was meant to be brief, but fate had darker plans. On the afternoon of October 5th, Lorraine and Wendy accepted a ride from members of the Hilton and Laurie gang, a group notorious for their violent behavior and criminal activities in the area. According to multiple witness statements gathered years later, the girls were last seen willingly getting into vehicles with these men, unaware of the horror that awaited them. Eyewitnesses recall seeing the 2 women trying to escape their captors, struggling apparently as they were forced into cars and driven away to remote locations. One witness described a chilling scene of the women screaming for help while men forcibly restrained them. Despite cries echoing across the Toowoomba ranges, bystanders often turned a blind eye. Fear of retaliation and the bystander effect, where people assume someone else will intervene, meant that few attempted to help. This tragic silence sealed the girls' fates. Initial police response was slow and fragmented. The local force was understaffed and overwhelmed, and the seriousness of the case was not fully grasped at the time. Early reports of missing persons were often treated as runaways or misunderstandings, delaying urgent action. Several witnesses attempted to report suspicious activities and strange incidents involving the suspects and the victims. However, many were dismissed or ignored, and crucial evidence was overlooked or lost. One young woman reported being sexually assaulted by members of the gang in 1974. Though examined by medical staff and having reported the attack, no follow-up or investigation was pursued. This lack of action was emblematic of a broader failure within the police system, reflecting victim-blaming attitudes and inadequate resources. Neighbors of the suspects described suspicious behavior in the days following the disappearance. For example, Wayne Hilton was seen removing the carpet from his car's back seat, which was stained with a dark substance resembling blood. Despite these alarming signs, no immediate police action was taken. In another chilling account, Desmond Hilton, an associate of the gang, recalled hearing them brag about violently beating 2 girls and cleaning the blood out of their car. Desmond later realized the victims were Lorraine and Wendy, the 2 missing nurses. The local community was deeply divided. While some were horrified by the rumors and suspicions, others were too afraid to speak out or become involved. Threats and intimidation by gang members ensured a culture of silence. Attempts by family members, especially Lorraine's brother Eric, to pressure authorities for action were met with frustration. Over the years, the case faded into the background, overshadowed by other crimes and a lack of tangible leads. Despite this, the memory of Lorraine and Wendy's last days never left their loved ones. The unanswered questions and lack of closure became a heavy burden for their families to bear. As the years passed, the case remained unsolved, but the story did not die. Rumors and whispers kept the truth alive beneath the surface, waiting for the day someone would dare to bring it all to light again. For months after Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans vanished in October 1974, their absence hung over Toowoomba like an unspoken shadow. It wasn't just that two young women had gone missing, it was the sense that something unspeakable had happened, and that too many people already knew the truth but weren't saying it. In those first weeks, there was no frantic police hunt, no helicopters scanning the bush, no search parties fanning out through the paddocks. The authorities treated it less like an emergency and more like a curiosity. They'll turn up, some officers reportedly told locals, but they didn't. And as the summer months rolled on, the trail grew colder. The bush outside Toowoomba is a place of strange silences, dense gum trees, dry creek beds, and long, empty stretches of dirt track where even the sound of your own footsteps feels out of place. It was in one such stretch of country, nearly 2 years later, that the first real answers would emerge. On the crisp winter morning of Saturday, 13th June 1976, two local boys, both under the age of 12, were roaming through the scrubland near Murphy's Creek. The area was rough and overgrown, the kind of place where kids might search for old bottles or chase lizards. But on that day, their adventure took a turn into nightmare territory. Cutting across a patch of tall grass, one boy noticed what looked like part of a shoe sticking up from the soil. Kneeling down, he brushed away some of the dirt and froze. Beneath the leaves and dust, he could see the curve of bone. Not animal, human. The boys bolted back to the road and flagged down a passing motorist, who immediately called the police. By mid-afternoon, uniformed officers were picking their way through the site. The remains, two separate sets, were lying in shallow depressions, partly buried but badly disturbed by time, weather, and animals. Pieces of clothing were scattered nearby, a torn blouse, a faded skirt, scraps of fabric that the bush had tried to claim. A handbag lay flattened under the weight of leaves and mud. The condition of the scene told its own story. This wasn't a place where two young women had wandered and died by accident. It was a place where someone, or several someones, had gone to great lengths to conceal what they had done. The remains were carefully collected and transported for examination. Even without modern DNA technology, forensic experts were able to determine within weeks that they belonged to Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans. The identification was based on dental records, personal effects, and the clothing fragments that matched what witnesses had last seen the women wearing. For the Wilson and Evans families, the news was a devastating double-edged sword. After nearly 2 years of uncertainty, they finally had confirmation, but confirmation of the worst possible outcome. Eric Wilson, Lorraine's brother, later said that receiving that call felt like a punch that keeps landing, over and over. Relief at finding her was drowned in the knowledge of how she had likely suffered. The discovery triggered an inquest, opened later in 1976 by coroner William Hill. Over a series of tense hearings, fragments of the truth came out. Witnesses described seeing the women in the company of known troublemakers. Others recalled hearing drunken boasts in pubs, men laughing about two girls who had been sorted out and gotten rid of. The Hilton brothers, Wayne, Daryl, and Mark, were mentioned repeatedly. Alongside them, other names surfaced, men with reputations for violence, particularly against women. Some witnesses claimed they had seen Lorraine and Wendy in the back of a ute belonging to one of the suspects, looking frightened and disheveled. But the case was riddled with problems. Much of the evidence was circumstantial. The physical evidence from the bush had degraded so badly that it could prove little. Worse still, intimidation was rife. One woman, who herself had been attacked by members of the same group in 1974, refused to testify, telling friends she feared she'd end up like those girls. Others, who had initially given strong statements to police, began changing their stories once the inquest began. Sometimes the changes were subtle. A detail dropped, a location altered. Sometimes the entire account was retracted. By the time Coroner Hill delivered his findings, it was clear the investigation had been crippled from the start. He concluded there was enough evidence to believe the women had been murdered, but not enough to commit any suspect for trial. In legal terms, the case was stalled. In human terms, it was a disaster. The Hilton brothers and other key suspects walked free. The families buried Lorraine and Wendy, but not the questions, not the pain, and certainly not the knowledge that those responsible were still out there. In Toowoomba, people whispered about the case for years afterward. Everyone knew someone who claimed to know more than they'd told the police. But in a town where fear had proved more powerful than justice, the whispers stayed whispers. It would be decades before the silence began to crack, and when it did, the revelations were even darker than anyone had imagined. For more than 3 decades after the shallow graves at Murphy's Creek were uncovered, the murders of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans seemed frozen in time. The original inquest had ended with no arrests. Witnesses had gone to ground, suspects had melted back into the everyday life of the Darling Downs, and the official file had gathered dust in a police storeroom. But behind closed doors, the story never went away. People remembered. People talked, quietly, cautiously, at barbecues, in pubs, at kitchen tables late at night. And the name that kept surfacing was the same: the Hilton brothers, along with a small circle of violent, predatory men who had terrorized women across the region in the 1970s. Over the years, a handful of witnesses tried to speak up again, but each time the same things happened. Statements were withdrawn. Stories suddenly changed. Some said it was fear. Others hinted at local connections, people in positions of influence who didn't want the case stirred up. Then, in 2013, something shifted. Queensland's Cold Case Unit had been re-examining unsolved murders, and Lorraine and Wendy's file was near the top of the pile. Advances in forensic techniques, combined with renewed witness approaches, gave detectives a reason to push for a fresh inquest. It was a chance to revisit the evidence with the benefit of hindsight, courage, and, they hoped, a community finally ready to speak. The reopened inquest began in Brisbane in September 2013 under State Coroner Michael Barnes. From the first day, it was clear this would not be a repeat of 1976. The coroner made it plain. The point was to dig deeper, to confront what had been left unsaid, and to bring clarity to the families. Witness after witness took the stand. Some were frail with age, others visibly nervous, but the stories they told began to weave together a chilling, consistent pattern. One woman, identified only as Witness D for her protection, described being assaulted by members of the same group around the time Lorraine and Wendy disappeared. She remembered being driven out to a remote area, threatened, and told she'd end up like those girls if she went to the police. Another witness recounted a night in October 1974 when she saw Lorraine and Wendy at a party on the outskirts of town. They appeared distressed, and at one point, Lorraine tried to leave. A man she identified as Daryl Hilton blocked her path and shoved her back inside. The woman admitted she'd never told police at the time because she believed no one would do anything, and I'd be next. Then came the pub stories. Multiple people testified that, in the months after the murders, certain men openly bragged about getting rid of the 2 women. One man allegedly said, "We sorted them out good. They'll never be found." Another boasted that they'd been taught a lesson. It wasn't just hearsay. Some of these accounts came from people who had been part of the group's social circle, people who'd sat in the same bars, ridden in the same cars. Their details were oddly specific. Descriptions of a dark-colored ute, of the exact stretch of bushland near Murphy's Creek, of injuries one suspect had the week after the disappearance. The Hilton brothers were named again and again, along with at least 3 other men. All were known to police in the 1970s for violent crimes, particularly against women. Yet somehow, none had ever faced charges in relation to Lorraine and Wendy. The coroner listened to every word, weighing testimony that had been buried for almost 40 years. He noted that many witnesses had lived in fear for decades, some moving away entirely to escape the shadow of the suspects. As the inquest progressed, the emotional toll became obvious. Members of the Wilson and Evans families sat through every day of hearings, listening to strangers describe their loved ones' final hours in horrifying detail. At times, proceedings had to be paused to allow them to step outside and compose themselves. But there was also a growing sense of resolve. The witnesses who finally spoke up were breaking a silence that had once seemed impenetrable. Every account, every scrap of memory was a small victory against the culture of intimidation that had protected the killers for so long. By the time Coroner Barnes prepared to deliver his findings, the picture was stark. Lorraine and Wendy had almost certainly been abducted, assaulted, and murdered by a group of men, including the Hilton brothers, in a coordinated attack. The burial site at Murphy's Creek had been chosen to hide them in plain sight, relying on fear and community silence to shield the perpetrators. The findings named names. Barnes said he was satisfied, on the balance of probabilities, that the Hilton brothers and several associates were directly involved. But, and it was a crushing but, without new, corroborative forensic evidence, no criminal trial could proceed. The suspects, many now elderly, would not face justice in a courtroom. For Eric Wilson, for the Evans family, and for the town itself, it was a bitter triumph. The truth finally on the record, yet justice still out of reach. But outside the coroner's court, as the media swarmed the steps, Eric Wilson made a point of saying that the fight wasn't over. The story was in the open now, and in the court of public opinion, the men who had lived in the shadows for 40 years could no longer hide. When the 2013 inquest concluded, the official record had changed forever. What was once a cold case, clouded by rumor, was now anchored by sworn testimony and an unflinching coroner's report. Names had been spoken aloud, names that, for decades, many had only whispered. But if the Hilton brothers and their associates truly were the killers, what happened to them in the years after 1974? And how had they managed to live freely while the families of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans carried a life sentence of grief? The answer was as disturbing as it was infuriating: the Hilton brothers' shadowy lives. By the late 1970s, Daryl and Wayne Hilton had already built reputations as dangerous men. They were linked to numerous assaults, intimidation of witnesses, and a string of smaller criminal offenses that somehow never seemed to stick. In the 1980s and 90s, they faded in and out of public view, sometimes in prison for unrelated charges, sometimes living quietly in small towns across Queensland. People who encountered them in those years described the same unnerving presence: men who could turn from friendly to threatening in seconds, who carried themselves with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. Some suspects named in the inquest had even been involved in other violent crimes against women. One was convicted of a brutal assault in the late 70s. Another served time for armed robbery. But for the murders of Lorraine and Wendy, there was never enough to bring them into a courtroom. And as the years rolled on, some of these men died. With each passing, the hope for a direct criminal prosecution dimmed further. Theories about that night. The reopened inquest had filled in many blanks, but some questions still gnawed at the public and at investigators. Why were Lorraine and Wendy in the exact place they were last seen? Witnesses placed them at a house party on the outskirts of Toowoomba. Some believed they'd been lured there under the pretense of getting help or a ride, only to be trapped. Others thought they might have been abducted earlier, the party simply being one of several stops before the end. The coroner's findings suggested the attack was not spontaneous, that it involved multiple men, vehicles, and a pre-selected dumping site. This wasn't a drunken assault gone too far. It was a coordinated, brutal act. One chilling possibility raised during the hearings was that the women had been targeted not just because they were vulnerable hitchhikers, but because they'd crossed paths with this group before. Some witnesses hinted they may have been warned away from certain men earlier, and ignoring those warnings had fatal consequences. When the inquest findings hit the news, the reaction across Queensland was immediate and explosive. For older residents, it was a reopening of a wound they'd lived with for decades. For younger generations, it was a shocking history lesson. Proof that a double murder could remain unsolved, even when an entire community seemed to know who was responsible. Phone lines at talkback radio stations lit up. Former police officers called in, some admitting they'd suspected the Hiltons for years, but had never been given the green light to push further. Others demanded to know why fear had been allowed to silence witnesses for so long. On social media, names were circulating. Names from the inquest, old mugshots, grainy photographs pulled from newspaper archives. People posted theories, half-remembered encounters, and connections between the suspects and other unsolved cases. Eric Wilson, now an elderly man, found himself in the spotlight once again. He gave interviews with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in court, but his frustration was palpable. "We know who they are," he told one reporter. "The whole country knows who they are, but knowing isn't enough." Not yet. The lack of charges didn't just haunt the families. It became a symbol of something larger, the failures of a justice system to protect the vulnerable and to pursue the truth, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. The 2013 inquest had cracked open the door, but the killers, some, if still alive, remained free men. And in small, scattered corners of Queensland, there were whispers that they were still feared, that even after 40 years, some people would rather cross the street than risk passing them face to face. As the dust settled from the inquest, one thing became clear. The fight for justice had shifted. The courtroom might never see the suspects in the dock, but the court of public opinion was delivering its own verdict. In the years since the 2013 inquest, the story of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans has refused to fade into the background. If anything, it has grown louder, carried on by journalists, true crime investigators, and ordinary Australians who refuse to let the victims become just another statistic. For the Wilson and Evans families, the inquest was not closure, it was a call to arms. Eric Wilson, despite his age, continued to appear in media interviews. His voice, steady but edged with pain, became a symbol of perseverance. "If I can keep speaking their names," he once said, "then people will remember. And if they remember, there's still a chance for justice." Lorraine's surviving siblings have attended memorial events, given statements to the press, and urged anyone with lingering memories or information to come forward, even anonymously. The Evans family, though more private, have supported every push for truth, knowing that public awareness might one day tide the balance. Podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels have all picked up the story. The case has been dissected in long-form investigative episodes and retold in haunting narrative videos that bring a new audience into the tragedy. Some productions have unearthed previously unknown details, an overlooked witness statement, a photograph from the night of the party, or an old police note buried in archives. The attention has kept pressure on the Queensland Police Service. Every few years, the force publicly reaffirms that the case is still open and that any new lead, no matter how small, will be investigated. For Queensland, the Wilson-Evans murders have become more than a single crime. They represent an era when hitchhiking was common, rural towns were tightly knit, and the idea that predators could operate in plain sight was almost unthinkable. The case shattered that innocence. It also reshaped attitudes toward policing in small communities. Many now question whether the culture of the 1970s, where certain men were known troublemakers but rarely challenged, allowed violent offenders to flourish. The murders have been cited in safety campaigns, public discussions on violence against women, and academic research into why certain crimes remain unsolved despite widespread local knowledge. Even after the inquest, speculation continues. Some believe the known suspects didn't act alone, that there were more people present during the attack, perhaps even women who helped lure Lorraine and Wendy into the killer's reach. Others suggest that fear and family loyalty still protect the truth, with relatives of the perpetrators staying silent to avoid reopening old wounds. There is also debate over whether the site where the bodies were found was the only location connected to the crime. Certain investigators have hinted at secondary scenes, places where evidence might once have existed but has long since been erased by time and weather. The most haunting part of the story is that the truth is known, at least in part, yet justice has never been served in a courtroom. If the identified suspects were alive and healthy, could prosecutors have finally pushed for charges? Or has the window of opportunity closed forever? What remains are fragments, testimonies recorded decades later, evidence degraded beyond forensic use, and a community's collective memory that grows fuzzier with each passing year. On the anniversary of their disappearance, small gatherings still take place. Friends lay flowers, light candles, and share memories of two young women who had their whole lives ahead of them. Lorraine, strong-willed and adventurous. Wendy, kind-hearted and full of quiet determination. The acts are simple, but they matter. They reclaim the women's identities from the shadows of their final night. The Wilson-Evans case is not just a story of loss, it's a story of persistence. It's about families who refuse to give up, journalists who refuse to stop asking questions, and a public that refuses to forget. Some crimes fade because time buries them. This one endures because time has failed to erase it. And so, somewhere in Queensland, there may still be someone who knows exactly what happened on that dark night in 1974. Maybe they were there. Maybe they heard a confession. Maybe they have a piece of evidence tucked away, forgotten in a drawer. If that person is listening, there's still a chance to speak, to give Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans what they were denied for half a century, the truth and the justice they deserve.